Hey, it's Phil, and welcome on the Habit Bootcamps podcast, where I interview entrepreneurs and coaches about their mindset shifts and habits. In this episode, I interviewed Tara J. Eash, who is a habit coach. Tara used to struggle with compulsive behaviors and obsessions until she found a way to break those bad habits. Now she's helping other people developing holistic perspectives on sexuality and personal growth. She's administrator of the Mindful Habit Partner Empowerment Program, where she's helping people and partners developing good and healthy mindful habits. She's speaking and writing about self-worth, healthy spirituality, and mental wellness. In this podcast, we talked about the problems of always trying to avoid conflict and being too nice, the importance of communication in relationships, how to develop a meaningful perspective and meaningful story, how she struggled with sexuality coming from a fundamentalist Christian community, and some misconceptions about habits. As always, let me know what you've learned from this week's episode by dropping a comment below, and enjoy this week's podcast. Hey Tara, welcome on the Habit Bootcamps podcast. If you would have to introduce yourself to my audience, how would you introduce yourself?
Well, I would say I'm a down-home country girl who loves books and writing and nature, and I'm a big family person. So I think in a nutshell that kind of encapsulates who I am.
You said a country girl. Why are you a country girl, and why you love the country more than, let's say, the city?
Well, I don't know if I guess that is true. I probably do love the country more than the city. I love nature, but I don't dislike being in the city. But I was reared on a farm and in southern Appalachia in the United States, and that was my entire childhood, and the same place, and just really learned to love agriculture and the outdoors and working people. So I definitely have a strong connection to that.
How important is nature in your life? You said nature is important for you.
I would say, you hear people talking about their keystone habits, and I would say that being in nature is a keystone habit for me. Like I have to spend time in nature. It's not like an option for me. It's kind of like sleep. So even my husband, I know, has made comments to me in the past that, I can tell you haven't been outdoors for a while. You need to get out, because I need to be out where the wind's blowing and you can hear the birds and see things. There's something about being indoors in modern life. It's so sterile, and there's usually white noise going on. You have the air conditioner running, or the windows and the shutters and everything's are all closed. And I didn't grow up that way. We didn't have air conditioning. The windows were open. You could hear what was going on in the outdoors, and then most of the time we got kicked outside and made to play outside. So it definitely is an integral part of who I am, and I think most people need that. But maybe those of us who are reared that way are just more connected with it.
Yeah, I also noticed that if you want to change your perspective and your perspective is too closed-minded, it's good to open up your perspective by being in a more open perspective, like physically, that you can see more. Because if all you see is just walls and apartment buildings, it also cramps up space in your mind. So just allowing to be more open physically can, in my case, help me also open up more thoughts in my head and let them loose.
That's a great perspective. I haven't thought of that before, but it makes sense, because when I'm outdoors, I am fully aware that there's something much larger than me. And when I'm inside, it becomes easy to get wrapped up in that narrow space that you're in. Like my whole world is about these four walls and what's going on my computer or on my phone, so I can see that.
A lot of people who interview on a podcast are very contemplative or curious. How was it like for you growing up as probably a curious or contemplative girl?
I was definitely contemplative. I was also very cautious. So the curiosity, I was probably low on that end as a child, definitely. Very cautious and a very anxious child. But the contemplative piece, I felt like for me, it was a lifesaver being able to just shut off the things going on in my mind that were negative, and to just connect with nature. And that's where I really became contemplative, was outdoors, and just, looking at the pattern of a leaf in a tree, or just being aware of this. I had this sense that of God. I would look at creation. So it really, in some ways, saved me, saved my sanity, because I had a lot of struggles with mental health, and it kept me on solid ground.
Contemplating became your second nature.
Yes, and it can also be a curse.
Yeah, because a lot of people say like you overthink too much or you analyze too much. So instead of helping you, it can also keep you stuck. So how did that work for you?
Well, yeah, that was definitely true as well. So I think, like many things in life, there's something really beautiful about being contemplative, and then there can also be a very dark side to that, and that is that you get stuck in your head and you can't get out. And I was definitely one of those people, and at the time I didn't realize, but I actually, from the time of 11 or 12, spent a lot of time wrapped up in obsessions and compulsions. I had no idea what they were. Mental health was not something that was discussed in my community.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not something anybody would admit to struggling with. And so I definitely kept that to myself, which also made it difficult, along with my contemplative nature. So I became very wrapped up in that process, and really a prisoner of it for many years. So yes, it definitely had a dark side.
Yeah, I remember me growing up, but even made it a bit worse was I was so dependent on the approval of other people and what other people thought of me. I was wrapped up in my head, but I was also constantly thinking what other people were thinking about me and thinking what I was thinking about myself. And that whole loop was like, who am I and what do I want to do? And it created a lot of stress and anxiety.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I spent most of my, and this is typical, of course, with adolescence, but I would say to a greater degree than many adolescents, I spent most of my time, like you said, creating stories about what other people were thinking or feeling, and trying to guess their motives. And really became the positive of that was that I became very adept at reading people. And so a lot of times I was pretty accurate about the emotional piece, but it's a very painful way to live, because you're always living defensively. So you're watching people, trying to read them so that you don't do something that offends. Or so it helped me become more empathetic in many ways, but it also helped me. I didn't see it as this at the time, but it also led me to being kind of manipulative of the situation, to make sure I manipulated it to where I positioned myself where people could not be angry with me as much as I could, by being the nice person, or making sure I didn't step on toes, or was hyper aware of people's moods. So yeah.
Yeah, this is a character trait that in general women have more, about being more agreeable and about avoiding conflict. But you can keep on avoiding conflict and postponing conflict, but at a certain point you will have conflict anyway. It's not that conflict is always negative, because when you have a conflict you can look for a resolution and get some insight out of it.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like anger. You can't get rid of anger, but a lot of people direct it inward. And so you're either directing it inward or outward. But it's still there. And like you said, the consequences are still there. And I spent years avoiding conflict in my marriage, for example. My husband and I, when we got married, we both came into it with this mindset that people who are in love don't have conflict, and people who love each other don't bring up difficult things. So it's your primary function as someone who loves someone to make them completely happy and comfortable in all ways, and never like rock the boat. So with that mindset, and we were very much in love and still are, but with that mindset, it was just, it was really toxic, and created, the conflict was still there, like you said, under the surface, and you have to do something with it. So if you're not going to talk about it, then you're going to internalize it, and it's going to make you miserable. So for us, I think it took about 16 years of marriage to get to the point where we hit our breaking point. That's a long time. But I've talked to people who've been through much more painful and longer scenarios than that, 30, 40 years of marriage before that, there's some kind of breakthrough and they realize this isn't the way to do relationships. It's interesting how we get locked in to something just because it's what we did in our youth.
And this is something I also realized, and that sometimes I have clients who say like, yeah, this is just a small irritating thing. If I really care about the person, I shouldn't really say that this irritates me, and just keep on stacking on top of each other every time it irritates, and it's like not outspoken, it's not spoken aloud, and it keeps on stacking and building resentment, and sometimes even disgust, and then finally they say it and it comes out with so much tension and load of all those years of not saying that it irritated them, because it still irritates them. They can ignore it out of caring, but it still builds up. And then people are finally having a conversation with so much emotional load that they can't just talk about it in a rational, reasonable way, because it's been building for such a long time.
Yeah, that scenario right there has describes much of my adult life. So and that is a pattern I still struggle to break. It's interesting it's surprising to me how the mind can always return to that. And so establishing new habits of communication in your relationships is really difficult. And I try to tell my clients, like, don't kid yourself that this is going to be easy. Because if you've been doing this for 40 years or 50 years, you're swimming upstream. And it doesn't mean it isn't possible, but you have to understand what you're dealing with. So it's funny, like, I spend my time helping people break bad habits like addiction and to pornography and poor self-management and all that. And still I struggle with returning to, these things. So it's not an easy road, but it's worth it. It's worth it because changing that style of interacting is so important, because I cannot describe to you, and you, like you said, you probably have experienced some of the same things, just the pain involved in that. It's so painful to live that way.
Yeah, and we do it, and then and when it happens to us, it's like, where did all of this came from? Why didn't you talk about this? But you also have things that you don't talk about, and that keeps on building up. It's a bit like seeing marriage or relationship at a graduation, but not as a scholarship. I mean, Alain de Botton talks about a relationship and marriage as a learning experience, that you can keep on learning, that you don't have to accept everything from the partner, and that not everything about you should be condoned by the partner, but that it's a learning experience. But sometimes this romantic ideal is, no, everything should be perfect. I should have no criticism. People should just accept me completely as I am. And there's no learning or communication going on anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing, like for people, especially that are my age and younger. Like there's this idea that, like you said, that I shouldn't come up with, the relationship should not ever make me face anything. But that's really what good relationships are the relationships that challenge you. And man, I don't judge anybody who has that perspective, though, because I was 38 years old before any of this clicked for me. So I am a late bloomer. I feel very strongly for people who are in their, 40s and 50s and 60s who come to me with these deep-seated problems, because I relate to the fact that, they feel they've lost all this time and they've spent so much time in their life living this way. But yeah, good relationships should challenge you, and that's difficult. I think a lot of times people give up at the crucial point in the relationship, that, when the conflict begins, then they think, like you said, this romantic ideal that, well, this must not be the one. Or even in friendships, this just isn't a good friendship for me. Like we jump to that conclusion automatically, and I don't know that it's the best conclusion.
Yeah, we also have this rose petal kind of look at the beginning, that everything about the other person is perfect, and there's no criticism. And then suddenly, slowly, a bit more realistic view kicks in. But, the expectations were set from the beginning. So,
yeah. And you fell in love with, or you started to like an idea about the person versus who they really are. This is interesting for me, this because in the last year particularly, I've had this personal transformation like 3 years ago, and this journey, and it's all been wonderful, even when it was painful. But I just, the whole idea that someone should be nice all the time, that is something I really latched onto in my youth. And I really equated that with morality and with being a good person. And so in the past year, I've been, just ripping the Band-Aid off on some of my long-standing relationships. And it's been very painful. I've been calling friends up and saying, look, I don't really feel this way about this particular thing. This is how I really feel about it. And I'm sorry that I haven't, all these years you've known me, this is how it's been presented. And I really truly thought that's how I felt because I was so delusional. My feelings were packed so far down underneath the layer of nice that you couldn't get to the real me. And it's been difficult on those relationships, because when you operate in a certain way in a relationship for 20 years, and I have some really long-standing friendships, it's like, well, who are you then? And rightly so, that person should question, do I really know you? This is new for me, and I'm trying to be patient with those people because they've been there for me all these years and have loved me and cared about me. But really, because I only presented this certain persona, they could only love what they, and I think for a lot of people, that's a big issue too when they come to relationships. Not only are they romanticizing the other person, but they're showing up not really in a genuine way, and they may not even realize it. I don't think most of us do. When we don't set out to deceive people. Most people don't, I don't think, when they enter a relationship.
Yeah, a great book also about it, and somebody who often talks about it, I mentioned him a second time now, is Alain de Botton, who wrote the book A Course on Love. And he also talks about the sulking. Sulking basically is, I'm not going to tell you what's wrong. If you really, really know me, you should guess and be telepathically gifted to really know what's going on, because else you don't really care about me. So it's kind of like a passive aggressive way of, being kind of like a child, and says like, you should take care of me and know all my needs. But the person in front of you is also a person who you will probably never know 100%, but with communication you can know, so it's a kind of infantile way of looking at people taking care of your needs.
That's a good way of putting it. And it's like expecting someone to have a window into your soul. And, I spent a lot of years, and I still love romance novels, but I spent a lot of years reading romance novels and being addicted to those things. Addiction's overused, but, just really wrapped up in the fantasy of it. And there's a lot of great things about escaping in that way. But yeah, I think a lot of us never mature from that perspective. And in those novels, what do you see? In Disney movies or whatever, you see this instant connection with people, and I do believe there are moments like that in relationships, and I think that's what makes it hard to drop some of these ideas, is that there's a glimmer of the truth in them. Like there are moments. I've had moments with people where I just felt like I connected with that person in a deep and powerful way, and there was no words for it, and there was nothing I could have done to make it happen, or to make it stop type deal. But I don't think their life is meant to be lived in that space. And I think that's where a lot of people get wrapped up, like in our work with pornography, for example. If you watch pornography to the point that it becomes your world, it's because you have this idea that you should be comfortable all the time. You should always not only be comfortable, but always be feeling this excitement and this sense of release, and all that's wrapped up with it. So you think that that's, instead of that becoming like just a part of your reality, it becomes your reality. And it's like, you have to take a step back and say, am I supposed to be feeling this all the time?
That's a bit like the link between, for women, let's say that they would avoid conflict and they don't want to be judged and they don't want to be criticized. But when a guy is watching porn, he's not being judged, he's not being criticized, everything goes the way how he wants to, and it's like a kind of persona and a mask, but it's not real life connections and intimacy and communication.
Yeah, it's play acting. So, play serves a purpose. And, that's children, that's the work of children, is play, and they learn and they mimic. But at some point, you have to do real life, right? And you have to take that knowledge into real life. And of course, I'm not saying that I don't truly believe that pornography can give you any deep insights into relationships or healthy sexuality. But I do recognize too, there are aspects of it that I understand why it appeals to people, right? So, but yeah, I do think there's a lot of us that when we're stuck in these negative behaviors, it is a matter, face things and face reality and be a person who's finally an adult. It's, we want people to take care of us.
Now, when I talk with coaches, I like to talk with the human also behind the coach, let's say the coach persona. So I've also been honest about my proneness to addictions. I smoked weed for 16 years, quit 2 years ago, overcoming porn addiction at the moment, kind of black and white personality, which can serve me sometimes when I'm really productive, I'm really going for something, but sometimes can also lead to addictive behavior. Would you mind sharing some of the things that you were addicted to or compulsive behavior, so people who listen to the podcast also have something like, oh, I'm not alone going through this. Like there's other people who also have these difficulties.
Absolutely. My biggest thing was romance novels. And so people kind of laugh at that. But really, romance novels, they served an important purpose in my life. And that they helped me escape the pain of dealing with constant obsessions and incessant thinking that was going on in my mind. And I didn't really know what was wrong with me, but I knew something was not right. And like I said, there was no outlet for me to talk about that. I grew up in a very sheltered atmosphere where people don't have those kind of problems. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I knew something was going on, and it was disturbing to me because I didn't feel I could control it. And so I had a lot of obsessions of a religious nature, obsessions about relationships. That was a big obsession I had. And then I also had some sexual obsessions and violent obsessions, which were very disturbing for me because I was reared in a very black and white, like you said, environment, and had very loving parents, really tight-knit family, but we went to a, what you would probably call a fundamentalist Christian church. And, any type of thinking like that was just seen as sin. Okay. So if you had thoughts that were not, so in other words, everything that was going on in my head, which I later discovered was most likely OCD type tendencies, which I've never been diagnosed with that, but I've lived with it most of my life. I know a lot about it, but anyway, I was trying to deal with all that. And so romance novels became my escape. And then of course there was the sexual piece that came with that, and discovering the power of sexuality to numb and to escape. So it became a constant thing for me. And then of course, unfortunately, that became something for me to feel guilty and ashamed about as well, because of my upbringing and just not knowing how to deal with that. So that was my biggest thing. And then I would say I was also very compulsive about pleasing people. Like I couldn't not please people, right? So I was falling all over myself. It didn't matter the cost to me personally, just to make sure people liked me. And that was everyone in my life. I mean, from like the most important relationship to some stranger I would meet on the street. So just very poor boundaries. And yes, that was definitely almost like an addiction for me.
Pleasing everybody besides yourself.
Yes, exactly. And self really had no, to me, self needed to die. And that is kind of what I translated from the theology I was taught growing up. For me to, what's the phrase? For me to die basically is for Christ to live, and that mindset, that's not the exact phrasing, but it's about killing your personal desires. But I took that to a very extreme in my mind. and felt that, any desires I had sexually needed to be eradicated, any emotions I had that were negative, like anger or sadness or whatever, those needed to be repressed because those could potentially make other people uncomfortable. So yeah.
Do you think in fact that some things are forbidden makes them appear in the unconscious and subconscious and makes them more tempting because they're not allowed to be expressed?
Yes. And I think they grow in power, like when you deny them, I really do. And I've just started to scratch the surface with reading depth psychology and starting to read Carl Jung, and
Me too.
just really appreciating like that. Isn't it, to me, it's beautiful, like the duality or the way he was able to see these opposing things. And
the fact about animus and anima, and the fact that we attract women or men into our life that has like a certain repressed characteristic of ourselves that gets played out and reflected back at us is immensely interesting.
Yeah, it's so complex, the whole thing. And I'm really focused right now on the persona and the shadow piece. And I think it's been, we talked about this in group coaching the other night with our addictions program. And it was a really great discussion because so many of the men that I work with have been reared in similar backgrounds to me, where sexuality was just kind of off the table. So I wasn't told like sexuality was bad. Nobody came up to me and said, sex is bad. You're bad if you think this or that. Nobody said toxic things like that to me, but it just kind of was not for discussion. Like there was no sex education at the Christian school I attended, none, no discussion of it. The only way you touched upon it, and I'm talking about, all the way through grade school through high school, was, that there was no PDA, no public display of affection, right? So that was it. That's as far as we got with sex education. In the church, you heard about the dangers of sexual sin, but there wasn't like, there was not like an in-depth course about, what to do with your sexual feelings or how you are a sexual being, and you cannot separate yourself from that no matter how hard you try. So even for a person who chooses to abstain throughout their life and become celibate, they have to deal with their sexuality to be able to do that. They have to face it. I can't imagine that they'd be able to do it successfully. Now, I don't have personal experience with that, but so yeah, I feel like that whole repression piece, people have to push that down into the dark, into the subconscious, and it keeps crying out, I'm down, I'm down here, notice me. And, I kind of tear up when I'm talking about these things because I feel what I felt as a child. And I remember so many clients that I've talked to who have said, they just needed permission to be sexual. And that was their biggest problem. It wasn't that they were some pervert or some, predator, or that they were a person who was even addicted necessarily. Some people are not addicted at all. They think they are, but in reality, it's just because they are tapping into their sexuality and they're hiding it. So there's shame involved in that. So.
An interesting concept about the shadow is the fact that it will not go away, but when you shed light on it, you can see your shadow and you can try to integrate it. That's also what Jung talks about, integration, not like, hey, we're going to push it away, because that duality and that integration, maybe at a higher level, step by step, it's always going to be needed.
Yeah, and that's an ongoing process. I don't think anybody is ever fully integrated. And, it's an ongoing thing because life is always changing. We're always changing, but we have a better chance of being healthier people if we're working towards that. And yeah, I still have some things in the dark that I need to bring to the light, and it's an ongoing process, but it's really a process of discovery too, I think. And something I've been learning, this Buddhism course I took recently, and that is something that's new to me as well, really, but was that they view like what's hidden as from the course I read. And of course there's so much material out there about Buddhism and different perspectives, but that what's underneath is really like the heart of everything. So it's like this solid foundation. In other words, if you just become aware, then love is there. If you just become aware, then compassion is available to you. If you just become aware, then you can step easily out of greed and hatred and delusion. So it's a different perspective that's been interesting to me while reading Jung. And I think it's not that, but basically there's some really good things to be found in the dark. Not everything in the dark is evil and sinister. So maybe it's just been hidden because it had to be.
Yeah, we live also in an age where certain fantasies, even fantasizing doesn't mean you will act them out, but it are fantasies. I mean, one of the biggest best-selling books is 50 Shades of Grey, and there are also archetypes and ways of being treated. Not that a woman wants it, but maybe it's a fantasy. You even had the book The Secret Garden by Nancy Friday in 1978, which was talking about fantasies women had, not that they wanted to happen, but some fantasies that they had. And yeah, it's often a taboo to talk about it. A fantasy is a fantasy. It doesn't always mean that you act it out, but if you feel guilty just of thinking about something, it can repress it even more with that cover emotion of guilt and shame.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of like us thinking that our thoughts are us all the time. Like this has to define me just because I thought it. And I actually don't believe people have control over their first thoughts. I don't know. I don't think it's possible to keep thoughts from coming into your head. I think they're just there. And the beautiful thing is we decide what we're going to do with them. Like, I think if people were truly honest, they've all had disturbing fantasies or thoughts that they weren't really comfortable with, and be like, oh, where did that come from? You know what I mean? But
when you're sitting in a car in traffic, for instance.
Right. It's amazing the things your mind will do when it's bored. So what do you do? Like you said, scream in terror and run. My response as a child would have been repent in dust and ashes, like, oh, forgive me, God, but now I'm recognizing and have recognized that it is what it is. It's there. I can do something with it if I want to. And if I don't, it doesn't have to be a big part of who I am, Okay. So, all right. That was interesting, but so.
I'm going to Jordan Peterson's lectures, for instance, who also talks about the psychological significance of the Bible. Now, I understand that the traditional marriage between a man and a woman, and that it's being seen as something sacred. I understand. I'm reading through the King James Bible again. But where does the part of sexuality being bad by itself and only being needed for procreation comes from in the Bible? Is it literally like in the Old and the New Testament, or is it something that the church initiated in later years?
Well, I think the Old Testament does a pretty good job in general, or did for me growing up, of driving. I had a lot of fear reading the Old Testament. We'll just put it that way. It had a good effect of instilling the fear of God in me. And I think a lot of that comes from, Mosaic law, but I don't know. I really, we're so far removed from that. Like so much time has passed and so many things have happened that I really feel the way that things are interpreted is the issue. Because there's a lot of beautiful and wonderful things in the Bible to be found, and there's a lot of hard truths too. But I think a lot of literal interpretation of things is what gets people into trouble in the sexuality department and any other department. And I'm not any religious expert. I've grown up in the church. I'm a minister's daughter, and I spent my whole life reading the King James. But yeah, I really think interpretation, because it's amazing. You mentioned Jordan Peterson. It's amazing what, with his knowledge and the mind that he has drawn from that. And I've actually started watching some of his courses online. So it's interesting you bring him up. And you have the self-authoring suite or whatever you talked about in one of your videos.
Yeah, I reviewed it. Yeah.
So anyway.
But the interesting thing about it is what he talks about is the Bible And Joseph Campbell also talks about it. Even your own story is a meaningful story. So even the self-authoring suite is like, how can we make our story a meaningful story? How can we use other meaningful stories to draw meaning from and give our own life meaning? So he looks at the psychological significance and how we can have a realistic, constructive way of navigating through the world and dealing with suffering, like what Jesus did, and transcend ourselves to, become a better person and have a noble goal and go for it. So even whether we want to or not, we're still in our head writing a story, but are we making it meaningful? So for me, meaning is more important than the literal meaning. If you have a story, you can still read it yourself and ascribe meaning to it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the literal, there was no other interpretation offered growing up, that it was very literal. Looking back, I realized, when I would read books like Revelation and things like that, I would think, we read a lot. So it was like, this isn't meant to be taken literally, So I think what you said about writing our own story, I think, when it comes to great text like the Bible, timeless text, that we should definitely I encourage people to go into it with an open mind and read without it's hard to do if you've been reared religiously, especially, read without all the interpretation and layered on things and expectations that people have heaped upon it.
People can teach conclusions or people can teach principles. I think it's sometimes easy when we read things as a conclusion that we don't have to think for ourselves and apply it. But if you actually see it as principles and then we have to do the work and think and create a meaningful perspective, it's not easy to construct a coherent perspective in our minds and our thoughts, then we have something that is our own experience, our own wisdom. But often it's just easy, like, yes, that's the way how it is because somebody else told me.
It prepackages things. It makes things more comfortable for people because they don't have to do the difficult work of thinking about it. And the people in authority, I think a lot of times people are driven by fear, parents, teachers, pastors, I think we're driven by fear, and we don't want people to make mistakes. We don't want them to ruin their lives. We want them to have a meaningful life. And so and then ultimately, from a fundamentalist perspective, you don't want people to go to hell. So you're driven by this thing that really, if you're not careful, causes you to impose all these things on other people in an attempt to save them. And that perspective is something I've definitely stepped away from.
Yeah, and you said you were a people pleaser. Maybe you were a God pleaser, but maybe sometimes what God's want you to do is please yourself and have a noble goal, not hurt people, but also take care of yourself so you can be a shining light and an example to other people. Instead of trying to please, but a part of you is feeling resentful, so it's still there, it's like when Adam after the fall tried to hide, and that God wouldn't see him. He can still see you. It's still there. Like, even if you try to superficially people please, a part of you is resisting and is actually not expressing itself.
Yeah, I think that the whole people pleasing, God pleasing thing, I thought growing up that I was pleasing God like that, but that was to, what other people told me, and so for me, I try to encourage people that I work with, and I work with a lot of people who are spiritual people, who are, believers, and I work with people that are non-believers, but I try to just encourage them to have their own personal walk. And like you said, it's an internal journey. It's not something, spirituality is, you don't need to impose spirituality on someone else. They're already spiritual in my view, and you are too. And so it's their role, if you believe in God, then I think that you should believe that you try not to step into his role. And I think that has been something that has definitely shifted for me in the last 2 or 3 years, because I was brought up that you need to persuade people of a certain way of thinking. But to me, that's, if there's this creator God, then that's his role. It's not mine, and I think he can do that himself. And I think if we're mirroring ourselves, patterning ourselves after God, then we take responsibility in turn for what we can control and what he's given us control over. If you believe that there's a God and you believe that he's in control of the universe, he's given you a personal agency. He's given you the power and the ability to control what you're going to do with your thoughts and what you're going to do with your mouth, and your actions and all that. So I don't need to get really religious, but for me, it's not about being religious. It's about just allowing people to have their own spiritual walk and their own personal agency. And a lot of denominations, people don't recognize, and a lot of different religious backgrounds, people don't recognize that their personal agency is being taken away. Sometimes they're just kind of giving that up for.
Yeah. Like, I'm even reading fables and parables and myths, in general, because I think it's like meaningful giving stories. So I take a look at what kind of meaning a certain story gives to them and how it cultivates their character. Now, everybody can follow whatever kind of religion they want, but the strange part is, like, you just have to believe in Jesus and then you're a good person. It would be somebody who was walking up to me and saying, like, hey, are you a good person? Yeah, because I believe in this friend and this friend is a good person. Yeah, but are you having the actions? Are you doing, the behaviors, the habits that make you a good person? No. I just believe in this good person. Okay, that can be a starting point as an example, but you still want to instill those principles and live that truth, make it a living truth and not a knowing truth. It's the same thing as, are you good in NLP? No, but I know this guy who's really good in NLP and I believe in this guy who's really good in NLP. Yeah, but are you actually practicing it? Are you actually good in
right.
it?
Well, it's like, kind of like the word I'm looking for, but it's like osmosis or something, like just by being near someone, you're going to like soak up their attributes, just by, like you said, just by saying you believe, you're going to exhibit the qualities that Christ exhibited or Buddha exhibited, and they had to go through some really painful things to get to where they were. So there's no escaping that like journey through, it's through, you have to go through, and not everyone. I've literally had clients ask me and how can I make this go away? Basically, I'm having problems with obsessions. How can I make my obsessions go away? I'm having all this pain because my partner cheated on me. How can I just make the pain go away? Is there any way to like erase the memories? And I'm like, that sounds like a fantasy. It doesn't sound like, you have to go through it. You have to have your own personal pain, your own personal journey. And I think spirituality is no exception. Like, if we're going to be connected spiritually, whatever that means to us, we're going to have to go through some pain. And that spiritual connection doesn't come by just associating with a certain group or saying the right things or wearing the right clothes. I mean, you can get really down to the nitty gritty here, right? Like, where people can have it spelled out for you. I mean, if you just look this way and act this way, then you have all of eternal life is open to you, or whatever, whatever the promise is, so
I think
I totally agree.
Yeah, I think like Jesus and Buddha both showed that suffering is a basic part of life, and they shown like an archetypical story how to, like in Jesus' case, carry your cross and give meaning, and transcend to a higher ideal. But it's not just like, yeah, Jesus did it before me, so he reached the end goal, so I don't have to go through it. I'm like, he's showing a story of a meaningful perspective in life, and you still can bury that suffering or pain sometimes and still stand up for something and give meaning. So he shows you to carry your cross, bear suffering and then transcend yourself in a meaningful way. Both Buddha and Jesus did this, I feel, but they still went through that. Human people can debate if a part of Jesus was human, right, or not, but still, he still went through it. Buddha still had, was the prince and still indulged in a lot of pleasures, before he finally reached illumination. So you can read your own story into it and use it to orient your life in a meaningful way.
Yeah, and Jesus had to leave the comforts of heaven to experience, in the biblical story, experience and to suffer. So yeah, I think there's a lot of important parallels there to our own lives. And I want to highlight, though, that, and this is interesting that we've ended up on this topic, but I'm glad the conversation has gone this way, because this is something really near and dear, just because of my upbringing and the things I went through. But I want to highlight that people often they think that the suffering has to be self-imposed. And they think that's the kind of suffering that's going to lead them to a deeper spirituality, when in fact, suffering just is. don't worry, you're going to suffer. Don't worry, it's coming. You can't avoid it, but you don't need to impose it. And so I think a lot of times what happens in a very legalistic setting is that, well, I need to heap these things upon my own head. I need to constantly remind myself of where I'm deficient spiritually, before I can be who I need to be. And I don't think that's what is meant by take up your cross and follow me. So that's just my thoughts about that.
Yeah, and we delve into this topic, but I'm interested in this topic, and I like to use, sentences and certain scenes from it. He says, judge not because they don't know what they do. So sometimes you shouldn't judge yourself because you didn't know what you did. But once you know what you do and you are aware of what you do, then you can choose another response. But if you're going to keep on judging yourself for a part in life where you were unaware and you didn't know, like it's hopeless. You're making the situation, that is maybe the imposed suffering on yourself that makes the situation worse than it is. It will always be a part of life, but you can make it better or you can make it worse.
Yeah, I think for a lot of this stuff, there is a really pragmatic answer too. So yes, there's the part of, like you just mentioned, the personal responsibility. And once your eyes are open and you see the light, then you have a responsibility, like you said, to take charge and do what you can do in that situation. But on the flip side of this, sometimes I think people, and this ties into what you and I do really, they really need to just change their habits. It's not necessarily a sign of it. Like when people are stuck in something and they see they need to take responsibility for it. Say they keep blowing up. I had a friend tell me the other day at the grocery store. We live in a small community, so anytime you go to the grocery store, you can't get out without having a conversation, which is really nice, actually, most of the time, unless you're in a hurry. But he's talking to me about how he has an issue with anger, and we got on the discussion about, is this really a deep spiritual flaw? Because he had spoke with his religious leader about this, and is it just a matter of you just need to repent? Well, like I do not see things in those black and white terms anymore, because I know how many years, like some of the worst advice is just that to muscle through something, to try harder, to be more sincere when it comes to matters like this. Because if you're stuck in something, chances are you've been trying to get out at some point because it's not good. Like, your pattern of blowing up with your family is not a good one, and you're hurting your relationships, yet you keep doing it, or that your porn habit is sucking the life out of you, yet you spend hours a day doing it, and it's making you miserable. There's moments of pleasure. There's that moment of release after you blow up, right? And you feel relieved, said what you thought. But then you have to look at your partner or your child in the face and realize the kind of damage that you've caused. So I truly believe most people just want to live a good life. And I believe that most people want to be happy, and they don't want to be miserable in their relationships and in their life. So the explanation often is like, to look, well, at your moral or character flaws. And maybe that is the issue, but how do you change that? And I think a pragmatic answer is really the answer a lot of times. And a lot of times for people of faith, the answer is not pragmatic. It's like, I'm going to pray harder. I'm going to read more. I'm going to meditate longer. I'm going to deny myself this or that or the other. Well, maybe you just need to sleep more. You blowing up every day. First of all, look at your sleep. Get your ass in bed at 10 o'clock at night, and don't be staying up till 2 a.m. and thinking that you can handle the pressures of modern life for the next 2 or 3 days when you had 4 hours of sleep one night this week. You know what I'm saying? Like, it seems like there is a practical answer a lot of times that I think we divorce practicality from spirituality. And we think that we try to put spirituality over here, kind of like sexuality, and put them up on a shelf, and they're their own separate things, and they have nothing to do with how I live my life. I don't know.
Yeah. Like, people want to go back to this blissful ignorance, original Garden of Eden kind of mind state, but they don't realize that what makes life interesting is that it's a meaningful giving story. And you're never going to watch a story where all the characters are super happy and content all the time and nothing bad happens, but that's how they can choose to be better or they can choose to be worse. So you can't deny that there are certain aspects in your life that you're not aware of. Maybe you wish you weren't aware of it, but you can't just take back awareness and act like you don't know. You know what kind of behavior you could do to better your life. You know what kind of bad habits you could stop. Doesn't mean you have to immediately stop them. But you could start doing those little things starting from today. And people are like, yeah, but what's my purpose? What's my vision? What's my task? I mean, what's a good habit you could start doing today? What's a bad habit you could try to start doing today? A gut feeling what it is. You're acting on a micro level or sudden illumination. No, those little habits you could start doing today. You're aware of certain aspects that you could improve gradually, but people seems to go for the magic pill or push it away. But deep down inside, they know what they could change or try out.
Yeah, but the spirituality piece ties into that magic pill really easily for a lot of people, because that is, I think, sometimes when we are in those spaces, that's what we're looking for, is a savior from things that we've already been saved from. Like, so save me from myself. Well, you've been given this ability to do A, B, and C, then do it, like you said. And I was watching your video this morning, actually, about how to stop procrastinating and how motivation is bullshit. And I thought, this is so true, because we wait for this good feeling. And I think a lot of times too, it's not just a matter of how we view God, like he's a magic pill, but also that we have this belief that we should be feeling great. If we're doing something good, then shouldn't we feel great about it? Like, shouldn't it be easy? Shouldn't it click? And like you pointed out in that video, not necessarily. Like, sometimes that comes later,
Yeah, that feeling of feeling fulfilled after you've done something good, that gives us like reference experiences like, yeah, I'm going to keep on postponing my instant gratification for something that serves me. But if you're going to be motivated to go, I mean, that's kind of like what God would be, like a higher purpose, right? God, you could see it as a noble goal or a higher purpose, right? I mean, oftentimes it's something that you have to suffer, sacrifice, put off things doing right now, but you will have more meaning, you will have more fulfillment, and you will be a better person. So rather just focus on not a to-do list, but a commitment list, and really go for it whether you want to or not. Start gradually with a habit, makes it easier, but just do it whether you feel like it or not, because else you will be fluctuating and will depend on the mood, but it's actually more your character, and a character is more permanent than a mood.
Yeah, character is what counts, right? And mood is just like a byproduct. And I think I'd read this somewhere that, when we live for like happiness, we're living for a byproduct. We're missing, like, the real deal is like having a life of character, having a life of meaning. And then the byproduct is you get to feel happy once in a while, but that's not a right. It's not a guarantee. And I think this is something older generations get really well. My dad's almost 78, and he gets that. Like, he gets that there's a lot of things you have to do that you don't want to do and that aren't fun. But if you do these, then later you get this reward. And I spent my entire life watching him do that, like day after day on a farm. There's a lot of farm work that is just drudgery. but as your character changes too, I think there's things that seem like drudgery that they start to take on new meaning. I don't know. Like, I don't know if I'm making sense, but you know what I mean? Like, sometimes tasks that aren't that fun can start to be more meaningful and be like, okay, I don't really mind doing this like I used to. I don't mind. For me, it was doing the dishes. It was like, oh, I just hated to do the dishes. And most of our first 10 years of our marriage, and even longer, like, there was always dishes piled everywhere, and they were caked with food. And time you got around to doing them, it took hours. I mean, and right now that I'm on this big kick that the kitchen will be clean. If nothing else will be clean, the kitchen will be clean. And it's been like exhilarating to get up in the mornings and be like, to see the fruits of just spending a half an hour cleaning the kitchen every day, because I get up and I don't have to look at that clutter. So that's a silly example, but.
No, it's creating order, it's the same two things that I do in the morning. I make my bed. So when I come back, it's like, nicely installed, and I'm proud of myself. And I take a cold shower for like 3 minutes that nobody really looks super forward to, but I feel better afterwards. So it only takes me, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, but I already did something that I know is good for me for the whole day. So what's 5 minutes if I can feel better the whole day or at the end of the day?
Yeah, the cold shower is one I have not been willing to suffer for yet. I actually tried that one day and I was just like, oh my goodness, I cannot do that. So I'll let you know if I decide to start suffering that in that way. But yeah, it's so important to just recognize that. And I think a lot for younger people, like just feeling like we ought to get the participation trophy, like and get the ribbon. Even though we've not done the work. I know I struggle with that with my teenage son, just trying to help him to understand that, yeah, you have all these privileges and things as you get older, you get more freedom, but with that comes, A, B, and C. With that comes the expectation that you're going to take care of your body and you're going to take care of your space and you're going to control your mouth and all those fun things that we don't.
Yeah, with tremendous freedom comes tremendous responsibility, because you still want to orient yourself. I mean, we live in a very comfortable society where we have a lot of options, but if you're going to raise children in a glass vacuum house, as soon as somebody coughs and they go outside in the real world, they're going to get sick. They have no resilience and adaptability whatsoever. I mean, don't want to generalize an entire generation, but when I was growing up by my granddad, it was like, the world is not a nice place. Put in the work and have respect and have integrity and do the work and you'll get there, and persevere and have some willpower and pay attention and be patient. Basic stuff that, maybe you don't want to hear that, but it's a realistic perspective and you're going to be confronted with it anyway. You can postpone and raised in a very safe environment, but one day you want to be able to take care of yourself and learn how to get something that you want, and it's not just snapping your fingers and it's there,
Right. If only that were so, that would be great. But maybe not. And I think too, the flip side of this is that with younger generations, there is this opportunity. Like, we have so much information and we are more sensitive, and so that is a positive. And so if you bring that sensitivity to mindset that you need to work hard and push forward, then it's going to be a lot different than, having that mindset and being harsh, which I think sometimes can be a struggle for the older generation because of the way they experienced life, maybe growing up, because they had things harder. So,
yeah, if we could balance it out with the current generation who is not weak, but more vulnerable and more in touch with their emotion, I think it's a great thing, because, you have an older generation who is just hitting their children and shut up, be a man, don't talk about your emotions, which is maybe a too rigid part of like, have respect, swallow your pride and keep on going. And it's just too rigid, so there's possibility for a great integration here from lessons from this generation and an older generation that, focuses on the hard work, being focused, like stand up straight. And the other thing is like open up, share your emotions, be vulnerable, so you can become a more authentic human being.
Yeah, we are really blessed. We're kind of stuck between the two, I think, and we have all this information about how we can do things differently, and it's at our fingertips and it's free for many of us, and I feel very blessed to be living at the time that we're living in. And sometimes I feel like that's a double-edged sword, because sometimes the fact that we are so comfortable keeps us from tapping into like realizing the urgency of maybe deepening our life and having a more meaningful personal journey. So,
well, with more comfort comes more people who are looking for things to feel discomfortable about, which are first world problems and are not really essential, while they could be really focusing on the essence, and they forget the essence that makes people happy, which is not so different from in the time of the Egyptians and the Greeks.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And realizing that we do have real problems to be upset about. And so I think that, like you said, we can turn away from the first world type stuff and, how long I've had to wait in line and whether or not I can find my charger or whatever, or even just, how somebody treated us or something that day, which for most of us is on a much smaller scale of being mistreated than many people in history have, would be glad to be in our position and just be flipped off, on the interstate or something. That's it. That's the suffering you had for that day, So I think, I lost my train of thought here.
Yeah, maybe Seneca or the Greeks were thinking like, how can I deal with 5 of my children dying? And he has a kind of stoic mindset. And now maybe people have to use it now when they're frustrated that their Wi-Fi signal is not working.
Yeah. And I think people can use that, maybe we can use those as like cues, those irritation at first world problems, to think, okay, what's my real problem? Because I guarantee you have a real problem, there's either, it's the way you manage your emotions, or a relationship you're in, or the fact that you're just living your life from paycheck to paycheck, or that you're satisfied with just, your idea of like connection is sitting in front of the TV for 4 hours every evening,
Mm-hmm.
So like, I think people still like we talked about earlier, suffering's inevitable. So let's make it meaningful and worthwhile.
Yeah.
We're going to process it.
Yeah. And, sleep, food, exercise, breathing, meditation, social relationships. I mean, these are like the big six, let's say, that, despite what happens, they're probably going to make you feel better, and you can fall back on it. So it's not that difficult. Now, I think habits are small steps that you take consistently and you can build it up. So it takes diligence and patience and perseverance, but it's manageable that you could just go to sleep before a certain time, or try to meet people 2 times a week, or try to cut back on the fast food, or go outside in the beginning for half an hour and just go for a run. It's not unmanageable when you look at your time. Like, there is still a small choice that you can make each day and build it up gradually. Like, you're not going to tell me that it's not possible. Don't talk about the ambitious goals or the big mindset shifts, but I'm talking about the little steps being taken each day, which make you have a little bit more control, self-belief, and maybe you can use that momentum and freed up willpower to also change some things gradually. It's not the magic message, but it is a message that works.
Yeah. And I think the magic message is the one that's we often need to like run from, because it's like the peddler, who is selling like dirt water or whatever, and saying it's this some magic elixir or whatever, just being like you said, the small things that can build your belief, your personal belief that you can do something bigger. 10, even you mentioned a half an hour or something. And I'm sure that you've had clients, and I have as well, where it's like, you have to get down to like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, for me, I've had to do that. Like, okay, reading was one of those things. So like, I was so used to reading fiction novels and speed reading, and it's a very painless type of reading and very entertaining. And when I would sit down to read like something serious, I would fall asleep. Like my mind was that like, I'm not doing this, So it was like, okay, I'm going to read this serious thing that I need to know for 5 minutes. And, eventually it builds and it gets better.
Yeah, it's what I also have with clients is some are really delusional, like really delusional people who want to become an entrepreneur full time. And I look at how they organize their day and they can't even put in like an hour or 2 hours of work. So sometimes they have to be realistic. Like, listen, I'm going to give you some realistic advice. You need to get a fucking job. You need to work part-time, get some structure, get some money, so you're less anxious about money worries, etc. Use that time wisely. You're going to appreciate the time more that is available, because let's take a step back. Let's take a look at your life. You're trying to be an entrepreneur and have the freedom and travel the world, but you can't even do the work right now when you have all that time. So let's just chunk it down, make it manageable, think long-term. You can do it, but the perspective you have right now is just unrealistic. You're just kidding yourself.
Yeah. I remember with Craig Perra, he was my coach. And 3 years ago when we started this process, my husband and I working with him, and he made me really angry on one of our coaching calls. And Craig is a great coach, but it was like, and that is part of the reason he is a great coach, because he was able to get to the heart of the issue. And like, for me, one of my things was I was going to be a New York Times bestselling author.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I hadn't written anything for anybody to read. You know what I mean? Like you said, it was delusional.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, where does this come from? You're not in any writers groups. You're not putting anything out there. Like, what makes you think you're going to, and now I have a much more realistic perspective about that. I would still like to write fantasy fiction more, but I'm not. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going around saying that I'm a New York Times, that's my aspiration. I'm not jumping from I'm doing nothing to, but it's hard because, I mean, we're taught, you could be anything you want to be, dream big, all those things. There's nothing wrong with that. But like you said, if there's not some basis for that in reality, then it's just going to be like a wish and a distraction and from what you really need to be doing.
Well, I call it planning credit or ID credit. It's like, I don't even have to do it. It's just like planning credit and ID credit. So it's almost the same as doing it. I read all these books about boxing. So why should I go boxing? Because I feel I'm already there.
Right. It's like equivalent to having already accomplished it or whatever, which, I mean, it is delusional. That's crazy.
Mm-hmm. There were also like a million things I wanted to ask you, but we delved into meaningful giving stories, etc. But let's end up with talking a bit about habits, and maybe I can have you on another time to talk about more about the great work you do with couples around sex addiction and about porn addiction. What are some misconceptions you think people have about habits?
I think that some people believe that it should be easy. Many people believe it should be easy to change your habits. So I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. Like, I've heard this from partners and from men that I'm working with trying to change their addictive behavior or compulsive behavior. So it's like, why am I not there yet? And it's been 4 weeks. You know what I mean? And so it's like, okay, how long have you been engaging in this behavior? Well, 20 years, you're just scratching the surface. Keep going. You know what I mean? Like, so I think underneath that is this feeling like, man, I should be getting this now. Like this, like a genuine belief, not like even laziness or anything like that, but just a genuine belief that they're really wholeheartedly sold on that this should be easier and should be faster. And so I don't know where that comes from. I'm assuming it's cultural. I don't know, or maybe it's just a desire to get it over with and get past the pain, so maybe it's just has nothing to do with that. But
it's a video I made about it. People who ask like, how long does it take to build a habit? You're asking the wrong question. You're not building habits to reach an endpoint. You do habits because it's something that is part of your lifestyle and makes you feel grounded, whether you feel like it or not. You don't think like, oh, now it's an endpoint. Now I don't have to think about it. Maybe you have to think about it less, but you're not reaching it to reach an end goal. No, it's a habit. It's something you do daily or consistently.
Yeah, and I think too that people, like you said, with the endpoint, sometimes there might be this underlying idea that I actually can stop doing this at a certain point. So it's possibly a lack of commitment to it, to the idea that I really am going to have to change a lot of things in my life, the way I do things, and not just for 3 months, for a 3-month program, but like permanently. I'm gonna, and that can go. Habits cover everything, so like it can range to like the people you're spending time with, the types of entertainment you like, things that you feel are deeply ingrained in who you are. Then you're kind of like, oh, it's not so appealing then when you start to look at it, like you said, as a lifestyle change and something that's going to be ongoing.
Yeah, and it's one of the challenges that I'm going to do, but set up a meditation practice and try it out and try different ways of meditating. But it's the same thing. Like, I'm only going to meditate when I'm have negative thoughts, or when I'm like anxious, or I'm only going to do it once all my suffering or thinking is solved. Like, you will never stop suffering in a slight way, even, or irritated or not thinking, but you just sit down and make it into a practice, and it becomes kind of mindset that you do regularly. But you don't just do it as a, when a crisis occurs and then you're going to use it. No, habits are there as a kind of foundation to return back onto, and that makes things more bearable, and that you're fluctuating less with how you feel, and that you can build yourself up. That's what all these good habits are for. You don't use them only in emergencies.
Well, this is one, I know I brought this up about my clients, but in efforts to be as honest as possible, this is one I struggle with a lot myself. And you mentioned meditation. So meditation was personally for me, just like, a light bulb turning on. It was just like, wow. Like, it was a big spiritual experience. The first couple times I meditated, I was like, I am freed from suffering. I am done. I have seen the light, and it was wonderful. And I stayed in that state for a long time. So I don't want to say it's a bad thing. It's not bad to have these big transformational moments and experiences where you just feel like you get it. and there's no way you couldn't get it, you know, you, even if you didn't want to, but it fades. And so, like, unfortunately, mine lasted for a very long time, or maybe fortunately, but it did lead me to have this mindset about meditation that I only need it once in a while. But I definitely feel that nothing is further from the truth at this point. I'm seeing that the foundation is so crucial. And for me, because of my mental health issues, I'm seeing it's either that or be constantly distressed. So which one do you want, Tara? Do you want to just meditate when you're in crisis? Or do you want and wait for the crisis to hit, and by golly, it's going to be a big one because you did not create the, you know, the home base kind of in your mind, the calm. You didn't cultivate that calmness in your mind before this came, before this new obsession came or whatever. And you know, you get plowed under if you have this kind of issues, because obsessions are not going away. That's something I've discovered. If you have mental health issues that are long-standing, they will probably always be your nemesis. And you know, I literally thought I was cured, like after my first couple of times of meditating, like it felt that great. But now I realize it's, you know, that was the wrong thing. It's not the cure. It's about the practice. It's about the way of living. So yeah, that's one I personally struggle with, and trying to just get more and more mindfulness incorporated into my everyday life, and cultivating the mindset that no, this isn't about the temporary fix. You know, this isn't about just the rescue meditation.
Yeah, I also had this period in my life when I was, let's say, the most happy, and I was constant in worry, like, I'm not gonna be this happy again. At a certain time, I lost it. Like, okay, objectively, maybe that was the period that I was like most fulfilled and satisfied, but I was clinging so much to that mindset that I was afraid of losing it. But now I have certain practices that I do and that I fall back onto, and it can make me manage life in a better way. I still feel sometimes better, and I still feel sometimes worse, but I'm not judging myself about it, um, about not doing it. But for me also, just being faced with all those thoughts of what you're thinking about, and then thinking like, okay, now it's solved, and now I will never have problems again. And then when you have it again, you again have that guilt and shame, like, Jesus, look at me, this habit coach, this life coach, and you know, I had it figured out, and now you think you're back to zero, or you're relapsing to the beginning, while you've traveled all this while and have paved your path all that time. But you don't look at it that way. You feel like, my God, what a failure am I that I'm back to this place, because I thought I was here. But no, you weren't there, you know, like, you optimized a bit, but you weren't there. So it's a reality check.
Yeah. And you felt, when along that journey, you felt you fall and you stumble at the place you're at then, like you said, not the place you were back then. So you have made progress. And I think that, you know, like with the whole life coach thing, I really struggle with that when I started, because I'm like, oh, I have to be this person, you know? Well, the reality is I think it's this, we want to present to people that, you know, if we're in a certain place that we have arrived. And I don't know, I think the greatest teachers, the greatest coaches are people who recognize we haven't, and we aren't going to. Like, we're going to keep moving. Maybe that's the difference between a great coach and someone who, you know, but we absolutely fall and stumble. And, you know, we've been talking about spirituality a lot in this call, and that's, you know, something that I've seen over and over in spiritual communities, where there's this expectation that someone will never fall or never come down from this great height that they've risen to. But they're really not, like you said, they're really not falling all the way down to where they started. They're falling where they are, if that makes sense. And it's okay.
Yeah, I had this happen a lot with people in the spiritual community. They act like law of attraction and everything is coming to me and everything is perfect. But sometimes I see these people 2 months later and they're just devastated because they were so attached to their spiritual ego. They pushed aside emotions, they pushed aside childhood traumas and acted like, I'm enlightened right now and totally detached from life. But life still happens, and then life happens and they don't know how to be resilient or deal with it. So it's almost like a spiritual crutch, you know, that you can use for a while, but then you will fall again and you will break your leg again. Well, if you could have used that crutch to start walking again and then throw it away, maybe you could start running again, you know. But people are attached to this kind of crutch and spiritual ego that, again, is just another mask that they put on.
I like that analogy with the crutch. Like, you can use it to keep moving, but it's not going to be the ultimate answer, you know. So yeah, I use Insight Timer sometimes, and I use Headspace, a couple different apps for meditating. And I was on Insight Timer the other day, and I follow different people, and I don't even remember the guy's name, so I'm not trying to, make fun of somebody, but I saw like a bio on somebody on there, and they said that they had basically arrived. I mean, that's what the bio said. They had arrived, they had been enlightened, and nothing had come back. Like none of the thoughts or feelings. And I thought, red flag. like to me, I just want to run from that because, that was so like ingrained in me that I need to arrive somewhere, and I need to reach this level of perfection. And because we never can, like, we're never good enough. You never reach that standard. And nothing you can do can ever be good enough. And so it's a very miserable way to live. And so you're locked in self-deprecation and misery, and wondering why you can't overcome this huge obstacle when really you're no different from anyone else. So it's an illusion, that there's people that I don't believe anybody has ever arrived. I don't know. I think we just need to dash that. And I think it's hard though, because human beings, we want something to admire and something to worship. And so maybe that's where that comes from. And maybe just recognizing that there are things in people that we can admire. There are certain things about them that we can aspire to, but also recognizing their humanity. But with social media, I think that brings a new spin on that, because, like we get ready for the call today, and I'm thinking, what's in the background of my screen here? And how does it look? And what do my clothes look like? And blah, blah, blah. And like, if I hadn't, my first, and obviously for business, you want to be professional and all that. And I'm not knocking that, but I think it's hard to get past the and see real people,
Yeah, and at least also back onto what we said, like, hey, we're gonna let God do things for us, or we're gonna let Jesus do things for us, or we're gonna let this spiritual guru do things for us. We're just gonna devote ourselves, and this person has to walk instead of me, But if you learn how to walk yourself and still be critical and use your own wisdom and experience to create a story, maybe based on some elements from other people, their story, you own your story, you live on your terms. But if you're just gonna sacrifice yourself to an icon, let's say a symbol, let's say, you're not really living your truth and writing your own story.
No, you're not. and we have so many icons or figures to like look to in our culture. There's I think it's really important for people to kind of unplug. And you had mentioned you were talking before this, I think, about you had a social media challenge or whatever. I think it's really important that people do that, and even stop like watching your favorite shows once in a while. Stop watching the news. Like, I am a huge proponent for not watching the news. Like I just
I made a video about it yesterday, and the video was called why you should stop watching the news and mainstream media, because it's your perspective into the world. And if your perspective into the world, if you have a window that keeps looking at poverty, people being slaughtered, like ashes, buildings, and that would be your view through that window in the house, would you really just not shut it off and not look at it each day, when the other side of your house would be pretty sunny and okay? I mean, this is your view of the world, and this is what you're feeding your mind, a perspective of what the world and other people is like. I don't think it's very constructive, and it doesn't focus on what is under your control and the people you could interact with and what you could change.
I agree. And there's a lot of animosity created by that too. So it's not only just all the bad things happening in the world, but us versus them, depending on who you're listening to. It doesn't matter who you are. It's always us versus them. And so, how does that taint the way we interact with people in our relationships out in public? Well, I think we can see that it does. And to a level that is just irrational sometimes. So I don't know. And that sounds probably very judgmental for me, but I do, I'm not saying that I can't get sucked into it. I can, just like anybody, and that's why I don't watch it.
Yeah, we judge whether you want to or not. But again, when you have that whole tribe mentality and you're not expressing your own meaningful story and live in it, it's easy to say, like, these are not the followers of this specific story that somebody else told people, and we all believe in this story, but there's still an individual choice of our own meaningful story. And if we can maybe find meaning in other people, their stories with we might not resonate with, but we can see how much it means for the other person, and it works for the other person. So why not? Not everybody should follow your story, you know?
Right. Yeah, that's probably goes along with delusion as well. Just thinking that, and I think that's a common human problem. I mean, if I think about just my personal relationships, one-on-one, I often entertain the delusion that the people I love should agree with me
Mm-hmm.
and should do as I say, especially my children, right? So, if I'm in a position of authority, I think, well, I'm your mother, so that's the end of the story. And yes, somebody has to be in charge and all that. I
Mm-hmm.
get all that, but just I think it's been helpful to me to step back once in a while, and sometimes I get really caught up in that, like, this is my role and you will listen, or get caught up in trying to convince a close friend or family member to my way of thinking. And then I'll realize, why are you devoting all this like energy to like making someone think or feel something, like, and trying to put myself in their shoes, because I definitely don't appreciate that. But I do think it's just part of being human, though, that we fall into those things.
Yeah, we probably wish that other people would imitate us, and but we best show principles and live by example. But if you weren't allowed to express your emotions or live your sexuality how you wanted to and give it meaning, a lot of people pass on the same kind of thing to their children, of judging them and not having them express themselves in a way and figure it out. But no, it's exactly this way, and that's the same thing that happened to you, and people pass it on generation by generation.
Yeah, that is definitely where the struggle is for me. And I, like I said, I've had really good parents, but they were reared, that this is what I said, you will do it, and there will be no question, right? So, and there's some benefits to that as well. So, like, I have a lot of respect for authority, but there came a point in my life where I realized that only goes so far. Not everyone should be an authority, that is, and not everything that comes out of the mouth of an authority figure is acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, we do, when that's deeply ingrained in childhood, we kind of pass it on. And actually, that's my big journey right now is, and I share this a lot in my group coaching and things like that. My ongoing journey is changing the way I parent. I have two wonderful children, and they're humans like me, and and they have flaws, and they can be annoying, but they're also really fascinating individuals. And if I'm not careful, because of my upbringing, I will squash any opinion they have, like, instantly out of the door. Like, they don't even
Mm-hmm.
have a time. And that's my first knee-jerk reaction, is to say, you can't have your own opinion. And so I think that's the hard part, is just learning to like look at our first reaction, which is usually what we've been taught, right? and say, yeah.
This is a difficult thing when I have a family of teachers. I try to suppress it, but there's actually a teacher in me. My mom was a nurse, so my mom wanted to do good. So I kind of combined what my parents wanted to do. But when I would be a teacher, or when my child would get reprimanded for speaking his opinion, I would be like, that's awesome. That's really good that you did this. And the teacher like, oh yeah, that's really bad what he did. And he said his opinion and he said this. And I'm like, yeah, really bad. And I think like, cool, he's speaking his mind and trying to figure out life by his own terms. So congratulations.
Right. That's that is a very healthy perspective for a teacher to have, I think. And I too like gravitate towards, I've found that, like, that's why I like group coaching, I think, is that I do like to teach, but a good teacher, like you said, leads by example and not by browbeating. So it's hard to strike that balance.
Now, before I delve into the concluding questions, is there anything that you would still like to share? I would love to have a follow-up conversation with you on relationships and communication relationships when there's problems with porn and sex addiction. But related to what we've been talking about, anything that you still would like to share?
Um, Off the top of my head, I can't really think of anything, but I would say, I guess, uh, personal agency is really important, in that if your spirituality and your journey, or what you've been taught to this point in your life, is leading you to always squashing that and always ignoring the internal voices, and never dealing with deep emotions and things, then I would strongly encourage you to take a step back and get a different perspective, get outside of your group or your community, read things that are different, listen to things that are different from what you're hearing. And because I think that can be a really dangerous path. I really do. So just from my own personal experience, it's a painful path too, to constantly deny that you have like a role in your own life, because you are the primary player. Like, you are the lead actor in your own life. And if somebody else is doing that for you, whether by default or because you're giving them permission, then I would encourage you to step outside of that box. So
if you wanted to give the audience and listeners some books that could help them with their mindset to develop a meaningful perspective, or that were important for you to cultivate personal agency, what are some resources, mentors, channels that you would advise people to check out?
Well, I definitely would recommend Peter Levine. He's a trauma specialist, and the reason he comes to mind right away is because of the work I do. So, I work with women who struggle with trauma symptoms based on their partner's issues. Their partners are struggling with sexual addiction, sexual compulsion. And I have been reading his book, and I can just tell you that I love the aspect. His book is Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma. And what I love about this book is that he talks about what you can do to start healing yourself. And a lot of times, we look to others first. And don't get me wrong, I think if you've been through some traumatic experiences, and many people have, that going to therapy and getting outside help is crucial. So don't misunderstand me here. But I also think along with that, we have to develop a personal agency. So I'd recommend that. I've also recently read Buddha's Brain by Rick Hansen, and I would recommend that. It just has a lot of great tips for overcoming the mind's natural tendency to be negative, that negativity bias. So those are a couple that come to mind.
If you could meet 3 people, living or dead, and you could sit down with them, who would you intuitively choose, and what would you talk about?
Wow, that's a big one. Well, I would definitely say Jesus, if I could meet him and sit down with him. And I don't know what the questions would be. And I guess Buddha is kind of up there with me too, up there with him too, for me, as someone I would like to meet. I think it would just be neat to just be in the presence of, of those individuals. So, whether you believe that, they were actually who they were portrayed to be or not, like who they were portrayed to be, those individuals, I would like to sit down with them. Also, I think Jane Austen. I love literature, so I would love to sit down with some of the great literary minds so that she comes to mind, and my ancestors, like great grandparents, and where I come from. That really fascinates me. So I would love to know more about my heritage. I have a Celtic background. Most of the people in my family are from Wales, and ancestry wise, and I don't know, it'd just be fascinating to know what really happened back then, because so much of history is written by those that are in charge and those who win. Mm-hmm. So I just think that would be fascinating.
When I talk about a meaningful and fulfilling life, what does a meaningful and fulfilling life mean to you?
Well, to me, it would mean being on my deathbed, if I would have time to reflect, and being able to look back and see that I showed up as often as humanly possible in a genuine way around other people, and also just with myself, being genuine with myself, and showed up in a way that made people feel loved and connected to me, and in a way that I could feel the same from them. So I guess a lot of it is just revolving around relationships, and feeling like I didn't waste my time doing things that were meaningless. And so that's a big focus for me right now, is trying to move away from that, because there's so much we can do in life that just eats up our time. So
Yeah, I want to thank you for taking the time to have a chat with me and knowing a bit more about your nature and how you develop meaning and helping other people their lives. If people want to check out more about what you do, where can they get in touch with you, contact you, and know more about the great work you're doing?
Well, thank you. I want to say first, thank you for having me, and I've really enjoyed this. So I you can contact me. I blog on feedtherightwolf.org, and so I have blogs on there. We also have a YouTube channel, Feed the Right Wolf YouTube channel, which I have videos on there about the work that I do with Craig Perra and the Feed the Right Wolf team. And those would be the best places to find me at this point.
Thanks so much for this awesome interview, Tara.
Thank you. You have a great day.
Hey, it's Phil from Habit Bootcamps, and I help entrepreneurs and coaches achieve more in less time by boosting their productivity and sales. If you would also like to get on a free consultation call with me, you should go to habitbootcamps.com/getproductive or habitbootcamps.com/getsales. And if you like my podcast, don't forget to subscribe and check out my Habit Bootcamps Facebook group and YouTube channel for some more awesome content.